Have you ever felt the weight of someone's judgment before they even knew you? That heavy, sinking feeling that no matter what you do, someone has already decided you're in the wrong. This is the story of a man who turned a moment of injustice into a life-altering revelation. A routine traffic stop spiraled into a night of tension, truth, and reckoning. Sometimes, life doesn't just deliver justice, it hands it out with poetic irony. Welcome to the tale of Officer Grant Larson and the one night he'll never forget. The rain fell in a steady drizzle over the quiet streets of Havenfield, a small suburban town where everybody thought they knew everybody. Elijah Brooks had just finished another grueling day at work as a paralegal downtown. Exhausted, all he wanted was to get home, kick off his shoes, and catch the highlights of the Lakers game. Elijah's old but reliable black Chevy Malibu cruised steadily down Maple Avenue, his windshield wipers working overtime. The streetlights reflected on the wet pavement, creating a shimmering mirage. The road was nearly deserted, save for a single pair of headlights that appeared in his rearview mirror. The sudden flash of red and blue lights broke the monotony of the rain. A heavy sigh escaped Elijah as he pulled over to the side of the road, hands instinctively going to the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. He wasn't speeding. His registration was up to date, and every light on his car worked perfectly. Still, he also knew why the officer might have stopped him, driving while black. The cruiser door slammed shut behind him, and a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged. His uniform was pristine, his boots crunching on the wet gravel as he approached. Elijah could feel the tension rise with every step. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice sharp and devoid of any courtesy. Elijah turned his head slightly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer, Grant Larson, narrowed his eyes, his hand hovering near his utility belt. "You were driving suspiciously slow," he replied, his tone thick with condescension. "Mind telling me why?" Elijah blinked, his exhaustion momentarily giving way to confusion. "It's raining, sir. I'm just being cautious." Larson smirked, leaning closer to the driver's window. His badge glinted under the faint streetlight. "Cautious? Huh? You hiding something in this car?" "No, sir," Elijah replied calmly. "I have nothing to hide." With measured movements, Elijah reached for his glove compartment and retrieved his license and registration. Handing him over without a word, Larson snatched them from his hand and walked back to his cruiser, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. Watching Larson through his side mirror, Elijah noticed the officer glance repeatedly toward his trunk, his posture tense, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. Minutes later, Larson returned, his face twisted in annoyance. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "May I ask why?" Elijah inquired, his tone polite but firm. "Step out of the vehicle," Larson repeated, his voice sharper now. Sighing, Elijah complied. He stepped into the drizzle, the cold seeping through his jacket. Larson motioned toward the back of the car. "Open the trunk, officer," Elijah said, squaring his shoulders. "With all due respect, you'll need a warrant for that." Larson's smirk returned, more venomous this time. "I don't need a warrant for probable cause. That's not how the law works," Elijah countered, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. Ignoring Elijah's protest, Larson marched to the trunk, fumbling with his keys. Elijah's pulse quickened as the trunk popped open. Inside was a neatly placed grey case, its surface sleek and unassuming. Larson's eyes narrowed as he reached for it. "What's this?" Larson asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's personal property," Elijah replied, his tone sharp, "and you have no right to touch it." But Larson was already unlatching the case. As the lid flipped open with a soft click, Larson's expression shifted. His cocky smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of confusion, then shock. He froze, his eyes scanning the document inside, a bold header that read Notice of Termination. Beneath it was his name, Grant Larson. Elijah crossed his arms, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Something wrong, Officer Larson." Larson's face drained of color, the document trembling in his hands. The rain fell harder, the pattering masking the sound of his shaky breaths. For a moment, there was only silence, save for the rain and the distant hum of traffic. "You've got some explaining to do," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm, as Larson's arrogant facade crumbled before him. Grant Larson stood frozen, the bold words on the document in his hands practically glowing in the dim light of the rain-soaked street. Notice of Termination. His name, Grant A. Larson, was printed clearly beneath it, alongside a list of charges: excessive use of force, harassment, misconduct while on duty. The accusations felt like physical blows, his chest tightening with every line he read. Elijah leaned casually against his car, watching the officer's confidence evaporate. "Didn't expect to find that in my trunk, did you, Officer Larson?" His tone was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. Larson's mouth opened, then closed, as though searching for words that wouldn't come. This has to be some kind of mistake," he stammered, his voice shaking. He held the paper closer, squinting as if reading it again might make it disappear. "No mistake," Elijah said, his arms still crossed. "That's an official document from the Havenfield Police Department, signed by Chief Warner himself." Larson's hands trembled as he flipped to the second page, which detailed the specific complaints against him: excessive profiling, unwarranted stops, and abuse of authority. There it all was, laid out in black and white. Each instance was tied to a date, time, and witness. He could practically hear the final nail being hammered into the coffin of his career. How did you get this?" Larson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "That's not the question you should be asking, officer. The real question is, why is your name on a document like this?" Larson's jaw tightened, his defensive instincts kicking in. "This doesn't make any sense. There's no way you." He stopped mid-sentence, the weight of the situation pulling him under like quicksand. Elijah took a step closer, his voice lowering but growing sharper. "Oh, it makes perfect sense. You see, I work in law. I've spent the past 6 months helping compile that report. And you've been too busy abusing your badge to notice the walls closing in around you." The words hit Larson like a slap. His knees felt weak, but he couldn't back down. "Not here. Not now. This is entrapment," he sputtered, grasping at straws. "You set me up." Elijah let out a bitter laugh. "Set you up, Officer Larson? You set yourself up the moment you stopped me tonight for absolutely no reason. The moment you decided you were above the law." The rain intensified, pelting the two men as the tension between them thickened. Larson took a step back, clutching the document like a lifeline. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "This job, it's all I've got. And that's the problem," Elijah shot back. "You treat it like your personal weapon instead of the responsibility it's supposed to be. How many people have you stopped like this before? How many people didn't have proof to stop you from getting away with it?" Larson's silence was answer enough. "You don't even deny it," Elijah said, shaking his head. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you?" "I was just doing my job," Larson snapped, his voice rising in desperation. "It's not as black and white as you think." "Doing your job," Elijah repeated, his tone icy. "Harassing innocent people, violating rights. No, Officer Larson, that's not your job, that's your choice." Larson's face contorted, his mind racing for a way out of the mess he'd walked into. "Listen," he said, his tone softening, "we can fix this. Nobody has to know about tonight. Just let me put this back, and we'll pretend it didn't happen." Elijah stepped closer, his voice steady and unyielding. "You think this is about me? About tonight? No, this is about every single person you've wronged. Every single person who didn't have the power to stand up to you. I'm not letting this slide." Larson's hands fell to his sides, the document still clutched between his fingers. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving only fear and desperation. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I need this job." "What you needed," Elijah said, his voice filled with quiet fury, "was to remember what that badge stands for. Protect and serve, not harass and intimidate." For a moment, Larson looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. His eyes darted to the paper, then back to Elijah, searching for some kind of mercy. But Elijah's gaze remained firm, unwavering. "Get ready, Larson," Elijah said, pulling out his phone, "because this is just the beginning." The officer's eyes widened as Elijah dialed a number and raised the phone to his ear. The rain fell harder, the sound of it filling the tense silence. Larson could only watch, frozen, as the other line picked up. "This is Elijah Brooks," Elijah said into the phone. "I've got Officer Grant Larson here. He's violated multiple protocols, including illegal search and harassment. I'm requesting immediate action." Yes, I'll hold." Larson's face turned pale as the reality of his situation sank in. Elijah lowered the phone slightly, meeting his gaze. "You thought you could pull this with no consequences," he said, "but tonight, the tables have turned." The rain poured harder as Larson stood in silence, his once cocky demeanor shattered into pieces. The rain was relentless now, drumming against the pavement and soaking both men to the bone. Officer Grant Larson's heart raced as he watched Elijah Brooks calmly speak into his phone. Every word Elijah said felt like a hammer driving another nail into the coffin of Larson's career. Larson clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing. He had never been on this side of authority before, helpless, cornered, powerless. He was used to being in control, to making people feel small. But now, the power dynamic had shifted completely, and the weight of his own actions was crushing him. Elijah ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. His gaze met Larson's, steady and unrelenting. "It's done," he said simply. "Chief Warner has been notified. They're sending someone to collect your badge and weapon." Larson swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice trembling. I made a mistake. Okay, everyone makes mistakes. Elijah tilted his head, his expression unreadable. A mistake? Is that what you call years of profiling and harassment? A mistake is forgetting to turn off your headlights. What you've been doing is a pattern, a choice. Larson opened his mouth to argue, but Elijah cut him off. Save it. You're not talking your way out of this. Not this time. For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the steady patter of rain and the distant hum of cars passing on the main road. Larson shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Why? Elijah asked suddenly, his voice softer but no less intense. Why do you do it? The profiling, the harassment, what do you get out of it? Larson hesitated, his defenses faltering. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It's just part of the job. No, Elijah said firmly, it's not. Protect and serve, that's your job. This, he gestured between them, this isn't protecting anyone. This is about power, about control, and it stops now. Larson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. What could he say? Elijah was right, and deep down, Larson knew it. He had let the badge become a weapon, a tool to assert dominance instead of justice. The sound of another vehicle approaching cut through the tension. Both men turned to see a black SUV pulling up alongside them. The rain splashed against the vehicle's glossy exterior as it came to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a tall, stern-looking man stepped out. It was Chief Warner. Warner's gaze swept over the scene, his expression hardening when he saw Larson. He walked over to Elijah first, extending a hand. Mr. Brooks, he said, his voice carrying authority. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Elijah shook the chief's hand. Just doing what needed to be done. Warner nodded before turning his attention to Larson, who looked like a child caught stealing candy. Officer Larson, Warner said, his tone cold. Hand over your badge and weapon. Now. Larson's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge from his uniform and removed the holster holding his service weapon. He handed him over without a word, his face pale. You've disgraced this department, Warner continued, his voice like steel, and you've violated the trust of this community. You're done here. Larson's eyes flicked to Elijah, as if silently pleading for mercy. But there was none to be found. Elijah simply watched, his expression unyielding. Warner handed Larson's badge and weapon to an officer who had stepped out of the SUV. Escort him back to the station, Warner ordered. He'll be processed and officially terminated. The officer nodded and gestured for Larson to follow. Larson hesitated, then looked back at Elijah one last time. He began, but the words caught in his throat. Elijah raised an eyebrow. You what? Larson swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'm sorry, he mumbled, barely loud enough to be heard. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Sorry doesn't erase the damage you've done. But maybe it's a start. Larson nodded once, then turned and followed the other officer to the SUV. The door slammed shut behind him, and the vehicle pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the rain. Chief Warner turned back to Elijah. You handled this well, he said, better than most would have. Elijah shrugged. Someone had to stand up to him. He's been getting away with this for too long. Warner nodded. He won't anymore. You have my word. As the SUV disappeared into the night, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice wasn't always swift or easy. But tonight, it had been served. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time Elijah Brooks climbed back into his car. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the empty road ahead. The tension of the night began to ebb away, replaced by a quiet resolve. What had happened tonight was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder of why he had chosen his path in the first place. Elijah started the engine and drove home. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers the only sound breaking the silence. As he pulled into the driveway of his modest house, he noticed the porch light flickering, casting soft shadows on the rain-slicked ground. He sat there for a moment, letting the engine hum before finally stepping out and heading inside. The next morning, Elijah's phone buzzed incessantly. Texts, emails, even a few missed calls, all from people who had heard about the incident. News traveled fast in Havenfield, and by sunrise, the story was already the talk of the town. Elijah scrolled through the messages. Some were congratulatory, others expressed shock, and a few carried undertones of skepticism, questioning whether Larson's behavior was isolated or indicative of a deeper issue within the department. It was clear that the community was paying attention, and Elijah knew this was his opportunity to make a larger impact. Later that day, Elijah found himself sitting across from Chief Warner in his office at the Havenfield Police Department. The room was stark, with beige walls and a single window that let in the midday light. Warner sat behind his desk, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to thank you for your composure last night," Warner began. "You handled a difficult situation with integrity." Elijah nodded. "I appreciate that, Chief. But this isn't just about me. Larson may be gone, but the fact that he was able to operate like that for so long suggests there's a systemic issue here." Warner sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're not wrong. The complaints against Larson were piling up. But without hard evidence, it was difficult to act decisively. What happened last night was the final nail in the coffin. And what about the rest of the department?" Elijah pressed. "Are there others like him? Because if there are, this town deserves better." Warner's expression softened, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "I've already initiated a full review of our practices and personnel. Larson's actions were a wake-up call. Not just for me, but for everyone under this roof. Change is coming." Elijah leaned forward, his voice firm but respectful. "It has to. People need to trust that the badge represents justice, not a free pass for harassment." Warner nodded. "You have my word, Mr. Brooks." As the weeks passed, Havenfield began to shift. The story of Elijah's confrontation with Officer Larson became a catalyst for change. Community members began attending town hall meetings, voicing their concerns and demanding transparency from the police department. Elijah was invited to speak at one such meeting, held in the Havenfield Community Center. The room was packed, every seat filled, with people standing along the walls. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as Elijah stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "What happened to me last night wasn't unique. It's a story that's played out in different forms for too many people, in too many places. But last night, we proved something. Change is possible. Accountability is possible." The crowd erupted into applause. But Elijah raised a hand, signaling for quiet. This isn't about punishing one man. He continued. It's about creating a system where no one, officer or citizen, can abuse their power without consequences. That starts with us. Right here, right now. By the time Elijah finished his speech, the crowd was on its feet. The energy in the room was electric. A collective determination to make Havenfield a better place for everyone. Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of that night continued to spread. The Havenfield Police Department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and community engagement. Officers were held to stricter standards, and an independent oversight committee was established to handle complaints. As for Elijah, he continued his work as a paralegal, but his role in the community grew. People looked to him as a voice of reason and a symbol of resilience. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when asked to step up, he did so without hesitation. One evening, months after the incident, Elijah sat on his porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The flickering porch light had finally been fixed, casting a steady glow on the quiet street. He watched as children played in the distance and neighbors greeted each other with easy smiles. For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt a sense of peace. What had started as a night of injustice had become a turning point, not just for him, but for an entire town. And as he sat there, listening to the hum of life around him, he couldn't help but smile. Justice wasn't just about one moment or one person. It was about the choice to stand up, to speak out, and to keep fighting for what's right. As this story draws to a close, let it serve as a reminder that justice isn't just a lofty ideal, it's a practice, a commitment, and sometimes a fight. Elijah Brooks' story shows us the importance of standing firm against injustice. Even when the odds seem insurmountable, it's not just about holding individuals accountable but ensuring that the systems we rely on are fair, transparent, and serve everyone equally. In today's world, it's easy to look the other way, to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. But stories like this remind us that one person's courage can inspire a wave of change. It's not always easy, and it may not always feel like enough, but every step forward matters. To all of you watching, let this be a lesson to carry into your daily lives. Respect and fairness should be the foundation of how we treat one another. No matter your role or position, remember that power comes with responsibility. Whether you're in uniform, in a suit, or simply a neighbor in your community, the values of integrity and empathy are universal. Stand up for what's right, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Advocate for those who can't always advocate for themselves. Be the person who makes a difference, no matter how small it may seem. If you found this story thought-provoking, inspiring, or even just a little bit captivating, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear the most compelling, heartfelt, and eye-opening stories that we bring to you, completely free. Hit the subscribe button now, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest content. Let's build a community where we share, learn, and grow together through stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay safe, stay kind, and always stand for what's right.